Hell is often presented as one of the consequences of rejecting God. But the more I thought about it, the more the opposite seemed to be true. If God exists, then hell cannot exist. In fact, I would say that if God exists, then God is incapable of creating hell. So how could the existence of God make hell impossible? Before I explain why, we need to define God and hell so we're clear on what we're talking about. In Western traditions, including the Abrahamic religions, God is defined as a being with the following characteristics. First, God is omniscient, which means God is all-knowing and therefore knows everything there is to know. Second, God is omnipotent, which means God is all-powerful and therefore can do anything. Third, God is omnibenevolent, which means God is all good and therefore God is as good as it is possible for a being to be. In other words, God is morally perfect. Fourth, God is the creator of the universe, which means God created everything that exists other than itself, including what we call our universe, whether directly or indirectly by creating the things that cause our universe to exist. This is obviously not the only definition of God that has ever existed, but it is a very common definition within Western religious thought, especially within Abrahamic religions. And it is a definition that I'm addressing in this video. Now let's define hell. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm defining hell as a state of eternal suffering or torment. It doesn't matter whether that means literally burning in hell or suffering in some other way. We don't need to elaborate on how hell actually functions or what is it actually like to be in hell or how hell looks like or anything specific. The specifics of how that occurs doesn't matter for this discussion. The important part is that a conscious being is suffering and that this suffering continues forever. If you simply define hell as something like the total separation of God, and that definition doesn't entail any conception of eternal suffering in some form or another, then that's not the conception of hell that I'm addressing in this video. And I'd argue that most people's conception of hell is the one related to eternal suffering. The idea that is typically pushed is that we should be scared of defying God precisely because of the risk of suffering for eternity in hell. To be clear, there are two essential parts of the definition I'm using. The person is suffering, and that suffering is eternal. That means the suffering never actually ends, and the person is never given another chance at redemption, otherwise it wouldn't be eternal. And I think it's reasonable to assume that no conscious being would willfully choose to suffer forever if they genuinely had a chance or an option not to. So the only way a conscious being can be in hell is if they have no choice. So for the rest of the video, whenever I refer to hell, I'm referring to this specific conceptualization. Now that we have established a definition, my claim is that if God exists, then hell cannot exist, which also means that if God exists, then God is incapable of creating hell. Alright, we have one more thing we need to clarify. If you have been paying attention, you may say, wait a minute, didn't you just say that by definition God is all-powerful and therefore God can do anything? And if God can do anything, then God should be able to create hell if God wanted to. If you've thought of this, then that's a good observation. Typically, saying that God is all-powerful and God can do anything is another way of saying that God can do anything that is metaphysically possible for a being to do. So God cannot do things that simply cannot be done due to the nature of existence, like create contradictions. For example, God cannot create a being that is greater than God. That wouldn't make sense because then God would not be God. But just because God can't do that, it doesn't mean that God is not all-powerful. So another way to state my claim is that the existence of hell is metaphysically impossible, therefore it is not possible for God to create it. In the same way, it's impossible for God to create a greater being than God. Now let's dive into the meat of the discussion. The argument will be actually supported by the third characteristic of God, which is that God is omnibenevolent. Due to this characteristic, God has to be as good as possible for a being to be, a morally perfect being. Think about this for a second. God is a morally perfect being. No being can be more moral than God. So all things that you ascribe to the quality of being moral, like being loving, empathetic, understanding, just, virtuous, or whatever list of qualities you want to create for morality, God has always and will always have the perfect attainment of these qualities. With that being said, does it really make sense for hell to exist as some form of eternal suffering as a moral punishment? Let's think of some examples to help us really think about it. Some religious people claim that non-believers, as in those that don't believe in God, will go to hell. Now imagine the most moral, non-religious person you know. If you don't personally know any non-religious people, hopefully it's not hard to imagine someone existing like that. When I say the most moral, it doesn't mean they're perfect, but someone you generally would consider to be a good person overall. Would it make sense to you that this person will face eternal suffering after they die because they're non believers? Does it make sense to you that God, which by definition is the most moral being that can ever exist, would willingly make someone like that experience eternal suffering? This person may have honestly examined the question of God and simply remained unconvinced. Our beliefs are typically shaped by the evidence available to us, the families and cultures we grew up around, our personal experiences, and what we genuinely find convincing. So, would a morally perfect God allow someone to suffer forever because that person was unable to believe something during their short and imperfect human life? Some humans won't condemn their worst enemies to that kind of punishment. I certainly wouldn't, no matter how much I've been wronged or how much suffering such person caused me. So if some humans are too virtuous to condemn their worst enemy to this kind of punishment, how can the most moral being to ever exist do such a thing? It gets worse when you consider that many people are told that those who follow a different religion or even a different version of their own religion will also be condemned to hell. Most people inherit their religion from the family and culture they happen to be born into. So would it make sense for God to condemn someone to eternal suffering because they were raised in the wrong place, followed the wrong tradition, or reached the wrong conclusion about the nature of God? So far, I've talked about the type of people that many would consider to be good people at best, and at worst, you may consider them to be misled if they don't end up following the same faith that you do. I'd extend this argument even to the sorts of people that we would consider bad people, even the worst of them. It boils down to the fact that everything bad that humans do is always going to be a finite amount of bad, but the punishment of eternal suffering is an infinite punishment. How can you ever justify infinite punishment for a finite wrongdoing? Maybe you can argue that a devil would be okay with this dynamic, but it's incomprehensible to think that the most moral being that can ever exist would accept it. Someone may say that we are so imperfect compared to God that we simply cannot understand how eternal suffering could actually be morally good. To me, this kind of response would be untenable. This type of response would basically erase every aspect of understanding that we have about morality and about what being moral even means. We obviously have to understand something about morality in order to be able to be moral agents and improve our actions. Our understanding of morality can't be so bad to basically render the existence of hell as something that can make sense in theory, just so we can support the claim that hell exists. At the very least, we would expect a moral punishment to be proportionate to what someone actually did. We might also expect punishment to serve some kind of moral purpose, like protecting others, rehabilitating the person, helping them understand what they did wrong, or giving them an opportunity to change. But what purpose does eternal suffering serve? It cannot rehabilitate someone if it never ends. It cannot give them another chance if their condition is permanent. It just sounds like pure evil, which God cannot be. My argument basically boils down to the idea that a morally perfect being cannot knowingly create or sustain infinite punishment for finite wrongdoing, especially when the punishment has no end and no possibility of rehabilitation. If that is what hell involves, then hell cannot exist alongside a morally perfect God. Therefore, if God exists, hell is metaphysically impossible. My main goal here is to give you an idea or a framework for how this argument can be made, and we'll leave it to you to determine if it makes sense that God is capable of creating hell. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. If you disagree, I want to hear what morally sufficient reason a perfectly moral God could have for allowing a conscious being to suffer forever. And I don't only mean explaining why someone might deserve punishment, I mean explaining why punishment must never end and why that person can never be given another chance. If you agree with the argument, let me know if you have a different or better way of justifying it. Thanks for going on this short intellectual journey with me, and I hope you at least found it a little thought-provoking and insightful.